Sustainability is actually something that's very broad. Firstly, what is the definition of it? Secondly, what is it that we need to do? What are the things that we have to do as a minimum? But then there are also elements of this that are, what are the discretionary things that we are going to do? So, for example, re-engineering our products and our services in order to meet a requirement. So often we just look at this as, I keep my operations the same, I keep my processes the same, I keep my products the same. All I need to do is account for the carbon that is incurred. And that actually is not the case. That's the step one or step zero of this journey. The next part of it is really looking at what are those products that need to change? What are the processes that need to change? What's the methodology that needs to change? What is my hybrid cloud strategy? Not my cloud strategy, because it's not just about moving everything to one platform, one cloud. We're seeing workloads distributed now into sensors right down at the end of the IP network, where it goes into the non-IP. So this is where you're into taking electrical signals and turning that into a censored telemetry feed. We're finding algorithms actually at that point. And there's actually the Elizabeth line is actually a really good example of that. It's coming under all these tall buildings, and what they needed to do in the Elizabeth line is not wait for the data to go to a data center to be interpreted and then being sent back to the engineers to see what was happening in the buildings. They actually needed to make that decision right there at the time as they were seeing the warping of the tunnel. And what they found was that the buildings actually were moving. They were actually twisting, so they had an axle twist. They were moving backwards and forwards. So as they were drilling the tunnel, they were actually also measuring in real time, and this was really in real time, how every sensor was deflecting and moving with that work. And they were actually able to see the movements of the buildings. Now, none of that data went to a data center to get interpreted and come back. It was all done at the sensor. So this is something that we also need to understand, is that we can't just take a workload and put it in the cloud and say, okay, it's over there, job done. That's absolutely not the case. We need to do something far more intelligent. So if we look at what it's all about, if we look at and everybody's on this journey and everybody talks about the SDGs, and we all talk about how we talk about materiality, we all talk about the environment, social and governance, but often what we don't talk about are what factors are within each of these. So within the environment, yes, it is about the carbon footprint, but it's also about the impact of a company's activities and what they do. That's also something that we need to take into account. If we look into the social, it is, yes, about having, as I've got here, safe and positive work environments, but it's also about your health and safety record. It's about understanding what is happening within the built space, and is it safe? Is it something that's conducive to work? We talk about working from home a lot. How many companies actually reach out to their employees and say, are you safe at home? And I would actually argue nobody does. They ignore it because it's outside their control, and if they get involved, it might cost them money. So stay well away. But that's still part of that social element. Then there comes all the normal activities around voluntary, all happens at the social level. And then governance, structure, auditability, compliance, meeting those stated objectives. How are we doing against those? So often we are always at the environmental level, sometimes at the social, very rarely at the governance. But those are the types of questions that rarely get asked when we talk about ESG. We understand what they mean, but we never really go into the next level. So based on that, what we came up with was to say, okay, let's make it a little bit easier. Let's look at this actually from a strategy point of view of the things that we need to do. And so there's a swim lane approach that we have. It's got 3 swim lanes. The first one is about the strategy. It's understanding what are the goals, what are the aspirations that we have, what are the roadmaps that we've got in place, what are the baselines that we think we have, not actually have, but these are the strategies that we are looking at in order to get to a particular point where we are comfortable and we believe that we're doing the right thing, and we are the company and its ecosystem. The next layer down is very much around the data, the reporting, the risks and the environmental. So these are the things that we are picking up and saying, these are the elements we need in order to be able to prove that our strategy is valid or is going in the right direction or needs to be corrected. And then below that, we've chosen 3 pillars. There's an argument that says that there are 5, there could be 10, it doesn't really matter. The more there are, the less likely you're going to do anything. So we've kept it very tight. So there is the built infrastructure, intelligent assets, facilities, and capital assets. There is the IT infrastructure, and responsible computing is in that. That's also from customers, compute infrastructure, networking, storage, and any of the compute platforms that we have in that supply chain. And then there's the supply chain and circularity within the supply chain. And the surprising thing is that all 3 impact each other equally, and that's why we have them on this chart. You could argue engineering should be in here. We can argue that there are many other pillars that are missing, but broadly, these are the 3 that most companies are engaged in. So if we then take that to the next level, that's great, Sven. You know, you have this wonderful architecture. Well, you may even call it an architecture, but it is an architecture at the end of the day. And it's a principle that starts to enable us to hang different questions on that. So we can start to look at, well, how do we optimize facilities as it impacts the compute? Because what we do with our buildings impacts the compute, and vice versa. So we need to understand and factor in those elements of the built infrastructure. If we look at the responsible computing, we want to understand, obviously, the utilization of those systems, but then also how do we manage end of life? I've noticed that the way we deal with this is by saying, okay, we're going to add 2 years to the life of the machine. But that doesn't actually answer the question. It says, now what do you do with it at the end of that period? Is it actually worthwhile to have a machine that's 5 years old rather than 3 years old? Does it meet the energy requirements that we have? Does it meet maybe the productivity requirements, but doesn't meet any of these others? And the answer is often no, it doesn't. And it's not a case that it's saying that we have to constantly buy new. There are so many advances in computing at the moment around power management, about usage, and about the way that workloads are handled, that it's often more effective to replace than to try and eke out. So that's one aspect. And then within the supply chain, there are a lot of decisions that are made within the supply chain that have very negative effects on the compute and on the intelligent assets. It is often found that a procurement officer will inhibit an ESG goal that a company has, not through lack of knowledge, but because of the way that they are driven and the way they are compensated. So they will look at individual SKUs rather than the lifetime value of a product, and they will make a decision based on the fact that that SKU is cheaper at that point in time, and therefore that's what they buy, rather than look at the overall 5-year or 10-year cost of having that product in place. So there's a lot of impact from the supply chain that has negative impacts on everything else. So again, understanding what those are and mitigating and working with them is quite an important aspect, hence the questions in the landscape. So when we look at the products, clearly there are IBM have more products than the 15 I think I've listed here, or the 10 I've listed here. But broadly speaking, it gives an indication of what it is we are looking at. So we're looking at line of business applications that very much around the enterprise assets and around the fabrics of built environment. In the responsible computing, we are looking at cloud capabilities, but also the physical infrastructure around storage, hardware, which is mainframe and power, but it's also the workloads that we have on those systems, which is why Turbonomic, Instana, and AI Ops would be in that domain. But then there are capabilities that are not listed in there, such as process mining, for example, is a Cinderella product that nobody ever talks about. But if you have a process, but you don't know how effective it is, and you can't measure it, and you can't baseline it, then it doesn't matter how good your infrastructure is, you're doing something wrong. You need to know what people are doing with the processes and how you provision or how they're using those systems in order to make actual and realistic representation of what I need in that infrastructure. Supply chain, clearly it is about knowing where my components are, but supply chains are much more interesting than that it also gives you product problems. So if I buy technology from an organization, I can start to understand the materials they're using, where they're coming from, what is the regulatory requirements, what are the chemicals that are used, and all of those things are routinely captured within the supply chain. And yet, when we buy hardware, we never ever look at the supply chain as being a fundamental part of that, of running a compute infrastructure. And this is actually quite deliberate. It seems that to me in technology, a lot of the e-waste problems we have are because we think that our supply chain is very difficult. And it is. It really is a very difficult. If you look at the individual components, if you look at there was a case the other day where Intel got caught. No, they didn't get caught, but people were starting to ask why certain transistors were of a certain color and the next batch were of a different color. Well, basically what happened was that they bought the like spec, but they have to go to somebody else to get those components in. Does that change the product? No, because they do it's done all the time. We are constantly changing the parts that make up a motherboard or a graphics card or whatever it happens to be. And it's as long as it meets spec, everybody's happy. But in an environmentally conscious world, we need to understand that, and we need to account for it, and we need to know when in the supply chain when it's vendor A supplying or vendor B supplying, because it does make a difference to how I then account for it. Now that's ridiculously picky, and nobody goes to that level, but you get the idea that supply chain is quite an important element. If we then move on, one of the things that we see is that people talk about sustainability as a reporting function, but in reality, it's more of a data function. There is a need to understand the data that we're collecting. So if we look at this in this really busy slide, and it's deliberately busy because it's trying to capture all of the different data points that you would be looking at from an ESG reporting perspective. So there are the company metrics in there, there's company data, which is clearly financial and often in nature. But then there are also the FTEs and building occupancy data. Then there's the various fuel data that we have. There's a lot of waste. There's also the client travel, employee travel, their shipping costs, all of the different data points that you would be collecting in order to drive an ESG report. There's a whole heap of technology underneath the cover that's going to deliver that, from building management systems through to obviously your frameworks and whether you're meeting or not meeting your goals, down to HR systems and internal IT systems, all the way over to geospatial data. So they all play a part. They're all part of this journey. So it's not just about how efficiently I can run my data center. It's also how efficiently can I handle all of these disparate data sources. And most of these data sources that you see here are manually inputted or are still very much text-based from what you call a PDF-based or document-based. They're not electronically shared. So that's the other thing that we always need to be mindful of, because we always look at this and say, well, sustainability is something that IT can deliver. And often the answer is IT doesn't actually carry this data. Which then comes on to the actual infrastructure components. The view is that if we move to the cloud, specific public cloud, we are addressing all the ESG requirements, and the answer is no. All we're doing is we're moving from scope 2 to scope 3. The important thing is actually managing all of it. It's how we gather the hybrid cloud approach, where we go from the point of where the IP network starts all the way through to the data center and everything in between. There's vastly more compute outside of the data center than inside the data center. We need to be mindful of the fact that if we move certain workloads from the data center into the cloud, we're not actually addressing the whole problem. We need to look at this as a holistic, and it is a holistic hybrid cloud approach that we need to take. So that's that infrastructure piece. And then at the technology, yes, a lot of these, actually all of those are the bad boys when it comes to the environment and ESG reporting, but actually you need to have all of these in order to make sense of what's going on. You have to have artificial intelligence. There's also advanced analytics. You need certain immutable and transparent technology, so you can share the information with your competitors as well as your suppliers. And you need to be making use of mobile technology. And as I said already, hybrid cloud, you have to look at your on-prem as well as your cloud infrastructure. You need to look at all of those individual compute rooms that you have and all the various networking systems that are feeding it, without feeling guilty that, oh, somehow I'm using dirty tech. There is no such thing as bad technology. It's just bad processes and bad ways of leveraging technology. It's about understanding the whole of that. And then what you end up with is the entire data supply chain that we need to be thinking about. And this is by no means comprehensive. It's just to give you an indication of what you need to be thinking about. So if we now get on to the actual reporting piece, we need to start looking at ESG reporting as part of a carbon management strategy. So that means it's about understanding what our disclosures are, all the way through to understanding how we are going to drive action plans and how we do that, how do we drive that continuous improvement into the operational space. It is not just about buying net new. It is also about understanding, if I buy these components, what else do I need to change? So if I'm buying a mainframe, for example, what is my containerization strategy? It's no longer good enough to say, oh, I'll just put the workload on there and it'll be taken care of. No, we need to really start to think about how do we streamline that workload and how do we actually improve the efficiency of that system. So what is the virtualization strategy and the containerization strategy, and how do we leverage both at the same time? It's not just about, okay, I buy this unit, it's brand new, I'm told I can load it up. No, we need to really think about re-architecting what that workload looks like and what those processes look like. Which then leads us into, are those targets that we have achievable? A lot of organizations state that they're going to do things, and then they've had to backpedal and increase their negative forecasts on where they're going to get to from a carbon point of view. And what that tells you is that a lot of organizations are making assumptions about the state of the organization without really knowing what the organization is capable of doing. And nobody asks the question, when I say I'm going to achieve this by this period of time, nobody then says, can the organization itself achieve that goal? Are we really ready? Are we culturally ready? Are we process ready? And do we have the technology that's needed in order to meet that goal? Because what we've all got into the habit of is saying, well, they said that they're going to have this goal, I'm going to have that goal. But nobody actually turns around and says, can we actually achieve this goal? Because that's a hard question. But we have to have achievable goals. And even if that means that we look a little bit poorer than the other, it's much, much better to show action rather than words. There are lots of words. Around 79% of organizations have action plans and so-called achievable goals. But out of those same people who responded to that survey, only 23% actually had plans in place to explore whether they could even achieve those goals and actually do something about it. So that is quite an important one.
Sorry.
Yes.
Something that we're reading, companies are talking about being operationally net zero,
yes,
but not actually net zero. What's the distinction?
So if you look at that, that's really interesting, because every company has the ability to define that their own way. What I would argue they're saying is that from their scope 1 and 2, they're going to be in a positive position, but all of that scope 3, the upstream and downstream, is work in progress. So, but I would still ask the question is, how are you defining your operations being net zero, but not actually getting to net zero? What is that? What are the boundaries? Now, that's actually a very valid and legitimate way of working your way through to a particular point, is to set boundaries and say, okay, I'm only going to look at this, and everything else is going to be outside of those boundaries, and that's exactly what they're doing here.
Yeah, because certainly the dates they put against being operationally net zero are much closer than
correct
proper net zero.
Yes, and it's also a way for them to explore this achievability piece that says, can I get to that point in time? And the answer is, it's not a bad thing to do, because what you're doing is you're setting yourself milestones and gates to achieve that. The other way of looking at it is that they are being more realistic about what it is they need to do. What is that transition plan that they need to be putting in place? What are the technologies they need to swap out or bring in? What are the processes that they need to change? And also, what parts of the organisation do they remove, do they sell? And what other components do they buy? So it's part of a much bigger strategy, but yes, that's where that is. And that's where that boundary comes in. And that's a very legitimate thing for an organisation to be doing. Instead of trying to swallow the entire elephant, they're basically saying, it's this part of the elephant that we're going to address. Does that make sense? And that's also a very honest approach.
It's interesting because it almost came across as a dishonest way of saying things.
Absolutely, it can be because of the way that it's worded. But what's really important for organisations when they do that is that they're very transparent as to why and what that boundary is and what does it mean for them and why are they doing what they're doing. Because if they can explain it, a lot of investors would say, okay, well that's realistic. We understand, we know who you are, we know what you do. And therefore you have operational challenges, and therefore maybe this is the right way to do it. All companies typically would be looking at something like that, not because they're an oil company and everybody hates them, but simply because they have such a broad operations. It's often better to just pick out certain areas. Yeah. So that's one thing that's very key. The second thing that's very key is to actually look at, and we've actually I've labeled this common gaps, and you would look at it and say, well, why is gas up there and solar and electricity? But as we will see in a couple of slides down, companies often do things from an operational point of view that's driven an operational effectiveness, or it is a cost saving or something like that. And they very rarely account for those in their ESG reporting, so it's often forgotten. And so what we are highlighting here is that there are things that people do already today, but they don't take into account. And it's often useful to put this up in front of people to say, and please don't forget wastewater or market-based emissions or headcounts and rooms and utilization, and what do your employees do? Because they all run around with compute, and therefore we need to know where they are, what they're doing, and different environments have different footprints. So we were talking earlier about the office being more efficient, but it also depends on the kind of office you're running. Certainly not that one over there with the huge air handling units running, that's not very efficient. But hotels are also quite an inefficient environment, or guest houses and the like. So we need to be taking that into account. Frameworks, yes. The point of this slide isn't to say, look at all these wonderful frameworks, it's look at the diversity of the frameworks. And organizations will have different views as to which framework they're going to follow. If you're IBM, you follow multiple. It's not saying that there's something wrong with that. It's just saying that if you have a very diverse business, the likelihood is that you'll be using one or more. The point is that there is quite a diverse landscape. All of them are valid. All of them have a point of view, and all of them, when the client engages, is getting benefit out of that. Whether that is the CPD or the science-based targets are clearly very important, very popular. SABS is also very popular, but you also see some down here from the UK government, which are clients that are also using. So all of the frameworks on here are ones that we see our clients use. And it doesn't really matter which one you choose, as long as you choose one and you exploit it to its fullest. And I know it sounds really odd when I say exploit a framework. Don't use it as if these nasty people are asking me questions. So when it says in the CPD, do you have a sustainability goal? Don't just write yes. And now I know that sounds really ridiculous, but there are people who do exactly that. Be a little bit more open, be a bit more engaging with that framework, because I would say if you just put yes down to the vast majority of the questions, it's the wrong framework for you. Or you're taking it too lightly, or you're taking it, you're being a bit disingenuous. Be engaged with the process. Everybody has to do it, and therefore it's going to become much more important, especially when we look at the January 2024 CSRP, or CSRD, I can't remember, it's the CSRD, the disclosure from the European Union is coming in, where it will be not only just the reporting frameworks that we have here, but also in your balance sheet. So,
would there be any financial penalties for companies not adhering to their own target or targets set by those those reporting agencies?
We are seeing, well, that is a new point, but yes. But we are seeing financial penalties for companies that don't meet it because the investors and the consumer walk away from organizations is happening. But what you're talking about is regulation that forces a financial penalty against
DORA
yes.
now forcing individuals employed by companies to pay their responsibility of the failure to deliver for the company.
That's right.
Do we feel that's going to be seen in any geography, not just the UK,
yes.
anymore of the kind of...
European Union will do that. Almost certainly they and anybody doing business with the European Union. Yeah, the UK will have to comply, the US will have to comply. Anybody that has a trading arm or subsidiary within Europe, you will have to comply to those regulations and those reporting frameworks and those reporting standards, and failure to comply will have a penalty and will be a fixed percentage against your gross profit. So these are things that are happening and will happen, and you will just have to deal with that. At the moment it's quite good because, well, quite good. They've set a banding for which companies are affected for 2024, but then they're lowering, increasing the banding for 2025, which is going to be much more inclusive. So there's a ramp in.
And what sort of size company is it? Is it based on size or?
Turnover at the moment, and they go to size. So think of the German Mittelstand, so that mid-market size.
Yeah. That's
where it's going down to.
Right.
In 2025. So at the moment, it's very much the PLCs and the Aktiengesellschafts, those large publicly traded bodies.
Yeah.
And then it will drop down. And it doesn't really matter whether you are a cooperative or whether you're a partnership or whether you're a limited company, or it doesn't matter if you fall into that definition of medium enterprise. Yes.
The important part is that it's not when the fines start arriving, you need to think about it.
You need to think before. Right now, because 2025 is not that far away. In fact, 2024 is not far away, and we know a lot of companies are saying, "Oh, we've got time." No, we don't have time. In actual fact, for 2024's rollout, we are all late. But that doesn't matter because most companies are actually in relatively good places for that. So. What we actual fact argue is that we need to have a capability to do three things. The first capability is we need to have that data foundation. We need to have the data. We need to be able to prove to an auditor that the data exists, that it is collected on a regular basis. And clearly, when you have the data, you can do the next bit, which is obviously doing the reporting and disclosure piece, which is fine. So that's always the important element. But what we would then also argue is to actually look at where you drive improvements, because once you do the disclosure, people seem to think that that's where the job ends. I've done what I need to do for this year. And that's probably true when we look at financial reports. We've done the job that we need to do for this year, but nobody in the finance department stops and says, okay, I'll wait for next year. They look at the values, they look at the output, and they look at what the strategy impact should be for the next coming year. And we need to do the same thing with carbon performance management. We need to then take what we have learned from this year's disclosure to drive out carbon in the operational environment for next year. So we are planning now for next year's disclosure, but that means we have to get into the operational processes. We need to understand what's happening. We need to understand what we can improve, what we can't improve. And here's the funny thing is, when we look at data center consolidation, we often see the energy utilization go up and everybody panics because we're now using more energy. But what we don't realize is that we've actually shut down an entire data center, and therefore we are being more efficient. So instead of it being 2 data centers rolled into one, therefore I've doubled my energy usage, I typically will have maybe a 1.2, 1.3 increase on the previous. So I've got a more dense workload. So in reality, that data center, whilst it's increasing its energy usage, is actually more efficient than it was previously before it was consolidated. So we need to start to become really quite aware of these kind of initiatives, and we need to look at what is the decarbonization actions that we need to take in the environment. So it's not just reporting. And to facilitate that, we've taken a modular approach that says, okay, well, can we bring in the modules around scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 and really manage my emissions, set the targets that I want to achieve, and work towards those goals. So that's typically where we would start. That's where most clients start. Then you have the framework reporting that gets added to that. So again, when we talk ESG, everybody starts with the reporting. We're actually arguing that we need to look at managing the emissions that we need to collect and the data we need in order to drive the frameworks. And then you have all of the other capability around build analytics or meta-analytics or whatever it happens to be. So what are those elements that we then need to drive out of the business in order to then go back into the data we're collecting, the reports that we're driving, and then back into the questions that we need to ask to drive out even more of those costs or those heavy energy usage systems. So in reality, it is you capture, you track, you report, and then you repeat. And that requires you to have, as I've got here, quite a large number of different types of data and a large number of connectors. So this is not a world where you can come along and say, I've got a single connection backbone, job done. It is actually really quite a diverse environment, so you need more connections than you have today. You need to collect vastly more data points than we collect today in order to be able to drive an ESG reporting strategy and be very effective at it. So now if we take it back to the responsible IT, when we buy equipment or systems, we often look at the speed, the feeds, the amount of deduplication, especially in the data world, and how we utilize the data storage very effectively. But what we don't do is we don't look at what it actually is giving us as far as a benefit to the ESG reporting frameworks that we as a company have. We need to start to change that. So when we see an improvement, let's say in storage density, that has a direct impact on somebody's ESG target. And we need to make people aware of that. We in IT are very shy. We're very reluctant to tell people how good we are. We're very good at actually saying we're delinquent in that we don't have efficient systems. We're very good at drawing the negatives out of our infrastructure and very bad at talking about the positives of the infrastructure, how well we run them, how few people we use to run these infrastructures. These are highly complex systems, and we run them extremely well. But we don't tell people. We talk about efficiencies, cost savings, but nobody's ever talking about, well, how much energy did you save? How much through that consolidation of data did I actually reduce electronic waste? Did I have an impact on emissions? We just don't think that way, and I think we need to start to do that. We need to push the question back onto the suppliers and onto the individual partners. What is it that we get, not only from a speeds and feeds point of view by going with this particular hardware, but also what is the environmental impact that we will get from this kind of system? Likewise, when we look at mainframes or power or actually x86, it doesn't really matter what the infrastructure is. We need to start to really get into this idea of what is the environmental impact of that particular piece of equipment. And we don't. We still are very much in the speeds and feeds and the density of work. All of those things are really good. We do actually, within the mainframe, talk about its power consumption, but we never tie it back to somebody's target. It's never highlighted as a benefit from an ESG reporting point of view. And this is actually, again, an onus on us to do better, and we don't. So that's something I would also argue that we need to look at. The other aspect is density of workload. We need to be thinking about using a technology that some people would say is outdated and antiquated, but is in actual fact very modern and is able to run high degree of AI workloads very effectively and explore how we then leverage that equipment over, let's say, a more distributed system such as the x86 estate. It's just something that we are very aware of, that companies are moving away from, let's say, the mainframe onto the x86 because the individual SKU is cheaper. But what we don't do is look at the overall lifetime cost of the system, and also what its benefits are to some of the goals that we have from an ESG reporting perspective. But again, that's something that we need to look at. So just to take some examples of, again, from a product point of view, if you look at something like the mainframe, one aspect that we've taken a lot of, or put a lot of engineering work into, is designing for a particular outcome. In this case, around the footprint of the mainframe, which means that we can standardize on the shipping, packaging for those mainframes. And so the idea is that when a mainframe is delivered, and it's not the idea, it's been going on since the late 90s, is to actually also reuse the packaging. And we have this goal that says we will reuse it at least 5 times, so that when we ship the system, that concept of package waste doesn't exist. But it's an important element. You have to design for that to occur. It's not, oh, I'm going to now have people come along and take the packaging back. No, it is really thinking about the whole system that says, I've designed the system, whatever it is, to have this packaging, and this packaging is designed so it can be reused. It's not a case that we just put people in to take the packaging and reuse it. So that's quite an important aspect. The other one is that can then lead on to how you manufacture these mainframes, or in this case, equipment. That is also quite an important thing. We've consolidated our mainframe manufacture in this instance, not because it's good to consolidate it, but because it's more efficient from an energy usage point of view. It's also very good when it comes to the take back. So when a mainframe comes to the end of its life, it returns to base. So it's a cradle-to-cradle approach. If you have a highly distributed manufacturing environment, you will also have lots of different ways of handling these systems, which leads to a higher degree of waste. So you do need to think about not only I'm consolidating because it's cost effective to do so, but you're consolidating because the design of the system you're delivering facilitates that. It needs it because those systems will come back, and we need to handle those and disassemble them and reassemble for a new distribution. So what does that really mean from our point of view? We look at the end-of-life waste of our products. So we generate somewhere in the region of 18,000 metric tons of waste. And we are stating that we have a 5%, a policy that states that we will allow 5% to go to landfill, but the reality is that we only send 0.3% to landfill. We are well ahead of the target we set, but that's a very deliberate design decision. You have to design your products in order to be able to reclaim the parts, reuse the parts, and have a low waste output. So again, it goes back to how you engineered your product. But as customers, we need to ask those suppliers, what is their waste policy? What is their design policy to mitigate the waste? We can't just say, okay, I'll take it back and here, I promise it didn't go to landfill. What do you actually do with those components which have only one place to go? I would argue, if you look at all of the phones that we have, most of them, actually, the fact is, most of them do go to landfill. Yet, a ton of smartphone gives you more gold than a ton of gold ore. You know, when I mine for gold, a ton of ore gives me less gold than a ton of smartphones. So why is it that we throw them away?
I think they are going to landfill. I think go to the back of my drawer in the study.
Funny enough, you should say, because when I walked here, I actually thought exactly that. Is it really landfill? No, the first place is it goes into the drawer. And I was thinking, well, how many do I have? Well, there are 7 iPhones, there are 14 Galaxies, there are some Nokias there, there's a 1390, sorry, whatever, that's a Nokia. They're all there, they're all in my drawer. And if you look at it, in actual fact, the stats state that that is exactly what is happening. So about 11.9 billion smartphones out in the wild, of which people are actually only using, well, active subscriptions, about 5 billion. The reality is a little bit less that people have, so it's about typically one phone per person. And the really horrific stat is that it's 3 billion a year turnover. So 3 billion out of that 5 billion. But out of that 3 billion, the vast majority are landfill or the back of the drawer, which is in effect is one of the same thing. But yeah, you're right. That is exactly the thing. But that's what we do with tech. We don't bring it into that cradle to cradle approach. It's cradle to someone. But that's an important aspect. And from a client zero point of view, and I didn't want to bring up all the clients that we've been working with, but really IBM have been looking at doing this to ourselves. So when we look at a data center, we don't just see, here's the fabric of the data center, here's the mechanical space of the data center, and here's the compute side of the data center. We look at it as one. So for example, if I increase the density of the workload in that data center, let's say it is a factor of 6. So I take 6 data centers and convert them all into one. Instead of then saying I need 6 times more air handling and mechanical capacity, what the team did was they said, well, how do I halve the air handling? Because if you take a megawatt of energy out of the compute space, you'll probably put 2 megawatts back in on the air handling space. So you really have, by being more dense in your workload, you've increased the air conditioning and air handling and all of the other mechanical activities you have in the data center. So our approach is to say, how do I run the machines hotter? How do I run them more dense? So 75% capacity at 85%. So instead of them running at a nice 21 degrees, 25 degrees cold air in, 38 degrees hot air out, how do I actually close the entire mechanical air handling, air cooling side down and go to natural cooling? So that's the sort of things that we're doing. And what we are finding is that it does actually reduce our carbon. So here we have an indication of the baseline from 2021 against the 2010 baseline, and we've reduced that by 62% by taking a more holistic approach between the equipment we run, the environment it's in, the mechanical space that's required, and how do we change that mix so we don't have this increase in density, increase in mechanical activity. How do I actually look at both and reduce one as I increase the other, which are, by the way, completely, they normally don't work in that fashion. The other thing that we've done is, again, part of what I said is, yes, we've looked at our compute infrastructure, but we've also taken a good hard look at the processes and the systems that we run within those compute environments. So instead of running with a lot of disparate systems across the globe, we've standardized onto 3 or 4 core applications. So we've radically reduced the amount of business applications that are out in the environment to manage our infrastructures, and we streamlined them down to 6 applications that are used. And the other thing that we've done, the third thing we did, was that we actually interacted with our operations partners, so the people who provide the facilities and provide the services. How do we actually interact with them, and how do we share the data between each of them so that we actually drive the operational efficiencies that we want, and not just have a contract that says X is going to provide Y. We understand that we need to manage with them how we get to Y. It's not just about a contract, it's about data sharing, it's about common platforms, it's about common integrations and common interactions. So that is where we get this replacement of tooling, and that has a benefit in its own right. So that is what I wanted to cover in this particular session. It is about not only looking at how do we drive efficiencies within the data center, within the equipment we have, but also across the broader scope. It's understanding that whatever we choose to do in one area has a direct knock-on effect in another. And it's also about us stopping from being shy, retiring, almost slightly geeky, if you will, to a group of people who are active and in the front line of an organization's sustainability ambitions. I really do believe IT are the people who will make a difference. and they can make a major difference when they engage with the rest of the line of business to drive an outcome. But they're very retiring and they're very reluctant to get engaged. And that means having honest conversations with procurement. It means having an honest discussion about what can be delivered, and not just be the heroes to firefight and deliver, but actually really get into that. If we do this, it has this impact on your ESG goals. It can be done, but let's have a discussion as to why or what else, what we can do differently. So it's about looking at the whole. It's not just looking at one element. Okay.